Hey, let's talk music today. I'm not really feeling political. And some folks have said, hey, in the comments or whatnot, you got those guitars in the background, how come you never play them? So there you go. Little Zeppelin. Poor man Zeppelin. So let's talk about my musical journey. And when I was talking about conspiracy theories a couple episodes ago, I mentioned some of this, and for me, the musical journey starts with the Beatles. So here's my original copy of Rubber Soul, just like my copy of Something New, masking tape on the side. Also, this is, it's kind of beat up. This is a mono edition, not stereo. Which at the time we're like, oh, stereo is better than mono. But now, the mono recordings were actually recorded differently than stereo. Those were two different tracks, as we now know. So I was all about the Beatles until, our family moved to Holland, and I saw the Woodstock movie. And so got this album Christmas when I was in 6th grade, and we lived in The Hague in Holland. And so this really blew the doors open for me. All the bands that were in that movie, particularly Crosby, Stills and Nash, Joe Cocker, Santana loved the drum solo in Soul Sacrifice. That drummer at that time was only 17 years old, by the way. 10 years after, Alvin Lee, I'm Going Home, just fantastic. Obviously, Hendrix playing the Star Spangled Banner, but the band that really stood out to me after seeing this movie, and I became a huge fan of, was The Who. And so, after I saw Woodstock, I got Tommy, the rock opera, and so the whole idea of a story told across, in this case, a double album, was novel at the time. And so you're, listening to the lyrics and trying to figure out what's going on with Tommy, the deaf, dumb, and blind boy. And the music's fantastic. And Pete Townsend is a very original guitar player. Not a great lead player, but really knows how to use chord voicings. He can use a D chord like 10 different ways in a song and give it a variety that's interesting to the ear. So the first concert I ever saw actually was in Amsterdam at a place called the Oude Rij, R-E-I, in 1972. It was the Who's Next tour, so that was the first concert I ever saw. Warm-up band was the Golden Earring, Dutch band, famous later for Radar Love. During these days, their big hit was a song called She Flies on Strange Wings. So amazing to see Pete Townsend live, and Keith Moon was still alive, and so forth and so on. So huge. Now we lived in a Dutch neighborhood, and I had this Dutch, I guess you'd call him a hippie, neighbor. His name was Bart van de Velde, probably 15, 16 years old. And at the time, I'm 11, 12 years old. So we lived in this row house in a suburb of The Hague called Scheveningen, which I always mispronounce, but it was a fishing village adjacent to the capital of Holland, The Hague. So didn't live on base. My dad was the assistant naval attaché at the embassy there, but lived in a row house. In fact, my wife and I went to Holland last year, first time I'd been there in 46 years, and we went to this house. And the family allowed us to tour it. It was amazing. It was one of those transcendent life moments. It was really, really a spiritual thing. And these folks that let us tour the house were very gracious. So anyway, my neighbor Bart was into music. He was in a Dutch band, long-haired Dutch guy. And he really helped me with my guitar playing. So I picked up the guitar at age 7 and didn't do a whole lot with it for, until I was in middle school. And because of Bart, I started to get more serious about playing guitar. And, he taught me different blues progressions and, lead tricks and that sort of thing. So, but he also introduced me to progressive or prog rock, right? And so this album, which is Yes's, actually it's their second album, but it's one of their early albums. And the song Yours Is No Disgrace and Starship Troopers and all that. So my dad had this big reel-to-reel tape player. And so Bart came over and recorded this album for me, and I used to just listen to it for hours and hours. And another band that Bart introduced me to was Pink Floyd. And this is before Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall. So this is an album called Ummagumma. And the song, which is actually the live version of Astronomy Domine, is really, it's kind of eerie, but it's intense. And imagine being 12 years old and hearing that song for the first time. And it's funny because this is the back cover, and I guess in that day they thought this was a lot of gear all strewn about this British countryside road. So I met Roger Waters years later in, when was that, 2015? He was doing a charity concert in DC for wounded vets, so I got to sit down with him and do an interview. Very opinionated guy, very politically active. Not everybody loves his politics, but he's a cool guy. I enjoyed talking to him. So anyway, that was my introduction to Pink Floyd. Another album that actually my dad really liked was this version of Jesus Christ Superstar. So this is the one that has Ian Gillan, who's the front man for Deep Purple. He plays Jesus. And then Judas is Murray Head, who was later on the charts for a kind of a disco song called One Night in Bangkok. But he's amazing. I view him as the definitive Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar. So this was influential in terms of my understanding of the Bible, but also music. This is really an amazing album that I played the grooves off of this thing. Now, there was this song called Top Pop in Holland. And the host was this cool guy. He reminded me of Bart. What was his name? Some Dutch name. Visser. And so he would do videos. This is way before MTV. It was a weekly show, and so they'd queue up these videos. And among the videos, the first time I'd ever heard of Alice Cooper was the video for the song Elected. And I loved that song. So I got into Alice Cooper, and I bought in a Dutch record store $1 Billion Babies. And so we're talking 72, 73 time frame. And so the record stores in Holland were very cool. In fact, my wife and I went by where the record store was in downtown The Hague, Den Haag. And it's not there anymore. It's now like a clothing store or something right there in the downtown area, which is a very cool historic area of the city there. But you used to go into this listening booth. So you'd hand the guy this album and he'd put it on and you'd go into the listening booth and you could listen to it. So I love this album. Now, my dad did not like Alice Cooper, and he didn't like that I loved Alice Cooper. And so this was the first time he actually pushed back on my purchases. And so he came up with this rule. So for every rock album I bought, I had to buy a classical album. So the album I bought after $1 Billion Babies was this version of Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, which is the Morton Gould Orchestra and Band. And this, I have yet to find a more beautiful version of the 1812 Overture. It's just gorgeous. And it gives me chills, if doesn't out and out make me weep when I listen to it. It's really a gorgeous piece of music. So God bless my dad. He was a clarinet player as well as being a Marine Corps attack pilot. So he wasn't the great Santini. A lot of people are like, oh, he was the great Santini. No, I mean, he was a hornet. But he was also a man of refined taste and very much influenced my approach to music. So thanks, Dad, for making me be serious about it. All right, now we fast forward to high school. And I had a friend, Van Reed, or I still have a friend on Facebook, Van Reed, but Van was totally into Genesis. And so I loved this album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. So this is also, I guess you could call it a rock opera. Peter Gabriel was the frontman of Genesis in 1974. He left the band right after this and pursued his own solo career. But this is another album that you listen to the story of the protagonist, this guy Rael, and it's evocative and very cool. So this is another influential album. Now, as I said, Peter Gabriel left Genesis, and Phil Collins, who was the drummer, became both the drummer and the frontman. Now, Phil Collins has got a gorgeous voice, as we all know. So I love this album. It's maybe my favorite live album because it's Phil Collins singing basically all of these Peter Gabriel songs, like Supper's Ready and some classic. And so I played the grooves off of this album when I was a senior in high school and when I was at prep school down in Texas before I went to the Naval Academy. All right, summer of 76, high school. This album was very influential to me, and it holds up. It's still fantastic. The Rats in the Cellar combination, those two songs, fantastic. This is Aerosmith, I guess at their drug-addled best. Cool album, and very much got me into a different sort of guitar playing. Okay, fast forward. Now I'm at the Academy. Buddy of mine, Dave Belt, we're talking music. He's like, hey, have you ever heard this band, the Dixie Dregs? I'm like, no. He's like, oh, no vocals, just a lot of different styles of music. And he said, I use it to study with. It's really cool. So I bought this album, What If, and it remains one of my favorite albums. And as a matter of fact, the guitarist, Steve Morse, and I became friends. So years later, I'm aboard the USS John F. Kennedy off the coast of Crete. This was 1986. And the USO had this, what they called the first Airborne Rock and Roll Division come out, which was basically members of Kansas, this guy from Pablo Cruz, Tom Johnson from the Doobie Brothers, and some other cats and dogs forming this USO show. So they were playing in the hangar bay of the John F. Kennedy, CV-67, which has been decommissioned. So I'm up on the flight deck, sitting in a jet in what we called the Alert 15 status. So the show starts, I can hear it, and a guy named Boo Boo Kingsley, who was not a huge fan of rock and roll, comes up to relieve me. So I get out of the jet, take off my flight gear, rush down to the hangar bay, and I open one of the side hatches, and I wind up backstage. And just in front of me is Steve Morse. I'm like, what? So I go up to him, and, you know, the music's kind of loud, so I'm like, Steve, what are you doing here? And he's like, I'm in Kansas. So he had joined the band Kansas as their hired gun for those years. And so I said, hey, meet me here after the show, and I'll take you up to the ready room. So we did that, and he came up to the ready room. And it turns out Steve's an aviator and loves to talk about airplanes. So we talked about flying jets, and a lot of the fighter guys in the squadron talked with their hands, and we broke out the guitars, and he played some of the Dixie Dregs favorites for me. And I'm just thinking, this is surreal. I'm off the coast of Crete aboard the USS John F. Kennedy, and here's my guitar hero playing my guitar, and we're talking jets. It was one of those moments during my Navy life that was just unbelievable. So fast forward, I'm teaching at the Naval Academy. This is 2001, actually right after 9/11. And the Dregs come to Annapolis, and they're playing Ram's Head, which is a local venue here. So I somehow found his manager, and he calls me. He's like, what's up? I say, hey, we met back in 86. He's like, yeah, I remember. And he's like, you want to come to the show? I'm like, sure. So I went to the show and we talked afterwards and caught up, and it was really cool. And I gave him a copy of Punk's War signed, because Punk's War had come out by that time. And so now fast forward a few years after that, I'm working on the V-22 program and working with Boeing and Bell, which are the two companies that manufacture the V-22. And so they're trying to make a promotional video. And so I had helped with the shooting of that. And I'm like, hey, I know a guy who can do the soundtrack. And I just said, hey, we need this budget. And they were like, sure, we can do that. So I called Steve and I said, hey, are you available? And he happened to not be on the road because he's also the guitarist for Deep Purple now, which he's been doing for a long time. He's like, no, I'm here. I'm like, hey, can you do this soundtrack? And I sort of described the V-22, which he knew about, and sort of what the video flow was like. He's like, yeah, come on down to his home in Florida and we can record it. So I did that. Spent a couple nights at his farm there in Central Florida. And again, just amazing stuff that I got to sit at the elbow of one of the greatest guitarists of all time working on this project. And the song was called Flight of the Osprey. It actually made it to one of his albums. So if you go up Spotify or whatever and type in Flight of the Osprey, you'll find the song. And the video, I think, is probably on YouTube as well, so check it out. So I see Steve every time they're in town. They were here a couple of years ago touring the Dixie Dregs. I think it was their farewell tour. So he's a very cool guy. And, you know, if you get to meet and get to know your rock and roll idols, that's very cool. Another way I was able to do that was with this band, R.E.M. So I've always loved R.E.M. I was introduced to them by the late, great Carol Taylor, who was a DJ at FM 99 back in the 80s. And she had this cool show, you know, sort of back when rock radio was a thing. And she introduced you to new bands like Rain Parade and stuff. And so she introduced me to R.E.M. And so this was, you know, Murmur and Reckoning, those albums, which I loved. And so I also got to be friends with the guy who was president of Cellar Door Productions, the promotions company, a guy named Bill Reed. And I just saw Bill last winter before everything shut down. I went down and saw another rock band, Kix, with my brother in Virginia Beach. And Bill owns the club where Kix was playing. So I caught up with him after many years, which was really fun. But Bill and I played pickup basketball in his house, and we'd have these conversations, and who's coming into town. And, you know, so I used to select bands, give tours of the F-14 squadron and the bass, and in some cases take them to the simulator. So Mike Mills, who's the bass guitarist for R.E.M., we gave him a tour of the squadron. He did the simulator, and he was really good. He was a very talented aviator. And we went to lunch at the Officers Club and so forth. So I got to know Mike Mills. Years later, I ran into him. I was on a cross-country flight to Atlanta with some other rock and roll friends of mine, the guys in Driving and Crying, who were recording an album called Smoke. And so we're downtown after dinner, or we're not downtown, we're at an area of Atlanta called Virginia Highlands. And Mike Mills comes walking in, and he recognized me. And my pilot was there with some friends of his from his hometown in Montana. And Mike comes up and gives me this hug, and we talk, and we caught up, and he walked away. And my pilot's friends were like, who are you that you know Mike Mills? I'm like, well, I told him the story. So I communicate with Mike sometimes via Twitter. He's very active on Twitter. But that was another kind of meet your heroes kind of thing. So one last meet your heroes story, because this episode's turning out to be too long. So we were sitting around the squadron after that Kennedy cruise. So we got home in spring of '87. And we're reading the paper, like, who's coming into town rock and roll wise? And it turned out Motley Crue was coming into town. So we call Cellar Door Productions. I didn't talk to Bill Reed. I talked to one of his associates named Bobby Melati, who handled the hair metal bands. And I'm like, hey, Bobby, we would like to give Motley Crue a tour of the F-14 squadron and the simulator. He's like, that's a very interesting offer. Why have you picked this band? I'm like, well, you think, and now Top Gun had been out. So when you think about rock and roll, Bobby, you don't think Kenny Loggins you think Motley Crue. And we were playing the Theater of Pain album a lot, and Girls, Girls, Girls had come out subsequent to that, and they were on tour for Girls, Girls, Girls. And so Bobby said, okay, I'll relate to the band. So nothing heard for 3 weeks. The night that the band is playing in the Hampton Coliseum, which is about 30 miles away from where I was living with my brand new wife, now my wife of 33 years, but we had just gotten married like literally 3 weeks before. Phone rings, it's Sunday night. It's Rich Fisher, tour manager of Motley Crue. Hey, you want to come over to the show? I'm like, honey, you want to go see Motley Crue? Yeah, when? Like now. So we did it. We drove. Fortunately, there was no traffic because you got the bridge tunnel there that can be clogged up. So we got right there. They'd arranged for parking right behind Hampton Coliseum. Right in, got our laminates or our little, backstage access stickers and walked right in. Met Rich. The warm-up band was Whitesnake. And you remember the Whitesnake videos with Tawny Kitaen. So Tawny Kitaen is like there. And so Whitesnake is just finishing off, coming off, and Motley Crue's going up on stage. So Rich is like, hey, just hang out. And so he came back. He put us at the soundboard for the show out, above the crowd. And then he came and got us, and we went backstage and got to meet all the dudes from Motley Crue. Mick Mars, the guitarist, gave me a stack of T-shirts that I gave away as Christmas gifts that year, which my wife still gives me grief about. And so the next day, Tommy Lee joined us at the Squadron for a tour. And there is a video, in fact, on my channel, if you look at the videos, it's called Tommy Lee Hanging with the Fighter Guys. So Tommy's super gracious guy, very cool. These were the rough years in terms of the band's partying. If you read Nikki Sixx's book, The Heroin Diaries, he actually talks about that show at the Hampton Coliseum. But Tommy was a real sweet guy and very cool towards the enlisted guys who'd gone to the show. And they loved the idea that he was touring. And he asked him about fixing the jets, and it was really a super cool. And the skipper at first was like, hey, what are you doing to me here? Because I didn't really, it's one of those big forgiveness, don't ask permission kind of things. So we did that. It worked out great. And they went on their way. But as they left, Rich Fisher was like, if we're ever anywhere where you are, please ping us. And we want you to come and say hello. So that was August. So in November, my wife and I now, brand new wife, have moved down to Pensacola. I'm now a flight instructor down in Pensacola. And I see that Motley Crue is going to be playing Mobile, which is only 40 miles away from Pensacola. So I call the agency in Hollywood, talk to Doug Thaler, who is one of the partners there with, it's Doc McGee and Doug Thaler. They were the heavyweights in the heavy metal, hair metal days. Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, Poison, those kind of bands. And so Doug's like, yeah, sure. We'll get you, backstage and comp you. And, oh, by the way, they're staying in this hotel. So you guys probably want to stay there. So we get there and meet Rich in the lobby. He's like, hey, you want to ride the limo over to the show? Sure. Yeah. It's at the Civic Center there in Mobile. And so the limo that we were in with Rich didn't have the band. Each one of those guys had their own limo. So we're in there with Rich. And we're just chatting. It was a short ride to the Civic Center. And I said, hey, Rich, is the warm-up band still Whitesnake? He said, no, it's a new band out of L.A. We think they're going to be big. They're on Geffen. They're called Guns N' Roses. So, I had heard Welcome to the Jungle on the radio, but I didn't have the album yet. So we got to see Guns N' Roses, and they were really loud and raw. And so imagine if you had no idea what Slash looked like in real life, meeting him at close range backstage for the first time. Wow. So there you go. So I just wanted to, as I say in my welcome to my channel sort of teaser, we're going to talk about a lot of things on here and not just politics. So thank you for indulging me here with a little bit of rock and roll sea stories. All right. As always, thanks for your support, subscribing, sharing, liking, commenting, and I'll talk to you again soon.